The history of anti-Hispanic bigotry in the United States. Never before have things seemed so hard for Hispanic migrants. The signals are stark and dire. A drowned father cradling a dead daughter, a lone mother defending herself against an armed Border Patrol agent with a terrified toddler at her side, a diatribe hectoring whites to purge the country of a rising brown tide. Welcome to Radio Labio's English program, where I share the most interesting notes of the day that you may not have had time to catch up on. Thank you for listening. I'm Juan Andres. A Walmart in El Paso strewn with the dead, caravans of the hopeful willing to suffer indignities, splinter their families, cower in cages, risk life itself for a distant dream, and looming over it all, an ex-president who shrugs his shoulder when a voice in the crowd shouts, "Shoot them!" And who tells Hispanics with deep roots in this country to go back to the cesspools where they belong? The ground seems to have shifted in this land of the huddled masses? Not really. These are long-held resentments. For centuries, they've been fed by ignorance, racism, and a stubborn unwillingness to understand a population whose ancestors were here by the millions long before the first pilgrim set foot on Plymouth Rock. The only new thing is that there was a man in the White House who exploited this resentment for his personal gain and at the expense of more than 60 million Hispanics in the United States and millions of Hispanics who want to come to the United States. Bigotry against Hispanics has been an American constant since the founding fathers. Not 10 years after drafting the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson smugly suggested that these United States might want to snatch Latin America piece by piece. John Adams held that a revolution in South America would be very agreeable, but he wanted little to do with a people he considered more ignorant, more bigoted, more superstitious, more implicitly credulous in the sanctity of royalty, more blindly devoted to their priests than any people in Europe, even in Spain. Managing to demonize a religion and dismiss a whole human order in one statement. The hatred was not reserved for Latin America alone, but also for the Spanish. A hatred inherited from the English, who had warred against Spain for centuries, raiding its shipments of silver and gold to Europe and Asia, and profiting from Spain's woefully mismanaged riches. More rapidly, it extended to the long-suffering indigenous population that predated the European arrivists. The rationale was not much different from the arguments that had gripped Europe shortly after the conquest. Were the indigenous really human? Wasn't it more likely that they were beasts of burden? However, whatever they were hardly of much importance. They were meant to work the soil, which they still do, work in the mines, and toil with bricks, which they still do. And, more importantly, bear children for the Europeans. They loved their women. And they instituted laws that agreed with all this. Way back when this country was first created. There are still laws in the books. from back then that were intended to keep us in place, keep us in servitude. By the mid-19th century, when the United States barged past its borders and pushed its dominion into the formerly Mexican lands that are now Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California, that indigenous population had become a mestizo population, or a mixed race people. But still the rancor continued. Presidents John Tyler and James Polk seized territory after territory in a fervent campaign to expand America's manifest destiny. In other words, to spread the virtues of American superiority. A grand project of expansion followed all the way to the wilds of the Rio Grande. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 marked the end of the Mexican-American War, but handed 55% of Mexico's territory to the United States. More territory than what remains as the country of Mexico today was handed over to the United States. But that victory came with hostages, the Mexican-American people, that grudgingly, population was not easy to exterminate, not by war, nor by verdict. There were too many to be herded down trails of tears or consigned to faraway exile, and anyway, they were useful, even if vexatious. They could not be handled the way the American Indian was handled. There were far too many. But they knew the land, they worked the land, and could be put to work for their white overlords. Eventually, President William Taft crowed, "The whole hemisphere will be ours in fact, as by virtues of our superiority of race. It already is ours, morally. Morally, it's ours." Taft went on to steal the hand of Porfirio Diaz, the infamous dictator, Mexican dictator, murderous dictator that reigned over the Mexican people, to care about nothing so much as protecting American business interests in Mexico and to order the U.S. occupation of Nicaragua. In fact, he had reached an agreement with this murderous dictator. Let us do as we will and take the riches that we want, and we won't interfere. You can do as you will with Mexico. In essence, that was the unwritten verbal agreement between Porfirio Diaz and our president. But the hand extended to Mexico did not extend to the Mexican Americans. In Taft's own country, lynchings of Hispanic became legion from California to Wyoming during those years. Yes, you heard about the lynchings of African Americans in the South, and you very rarely hear about the lynchings of Hispanics. But yes, there were. Thousands. Sad period of history. And they went ignored. Tracked only by outraged Mexican diplomats from Mexico who had little power to control the carnage. If they went and complained to their government, the agreement between Porfirio and our president, nothing happened. And if they came here and complained to our president and our government of the United States, they were totally ignored. As the early 20th century progressed, the volatile politics of our southern neighbor spurred even more Mexican immigration to the United States, delighting American businessmen who needed cheap labor to build railroad tracks, erect towns, toil on ranches, and stoop over agricultural fields day and night. Mexican Americans were wanted for their sweat, their military service, their taxes, but not for their children or their company. It's this unacceptable past that Trump wants to return to. In Trump's vision of a white America, immigrants should be grateful and servile. Continue serving their white overlords and be grateful for it. Resentment against the growing Hispanic presence in cities and schools found voice in English-only edicts, emboldening white Americans to treat Latinos as an unwelcome foreign underclass. For example, in the small Texas town of Three Rivers, a Hispanic soldier returning from World War II in a coffin was denied a proper funeral because he wasn't white. Farther west in California, political cartoonists and crime novelists were characterizing a rising tide of young Mexican-American males as a menace. So in Los Angeles, this caused thousands of soldiers and civilians to descend on Hispanic youths in 1942 in a virulent attack known as the Zoot Suit Riots. Brown Americans were at that time pushed into segregated communities, forbidden from serving on juries, their children made to attend Mexican-only schools, and in southern Arizona, migrant farm workers who were considered to be a problem were kidnapped, robbed, tortured, their feet seared over fire, and told to go home. And if we see you again, things will be worse. Within our own lifetimes, Latin America doesn't matter, said Richard Nixon, even as he was issuing directives to throttle Chile's economy and bring an inconvenient socialist government to its knees. People don't give an S about the place, said our president. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger concurred. People don't give an S. What happens down there, he said, Kissinger, has no importance. And so Americans have not been very curious about the region that is feeding and burgeoning Hispanic populations in the United States. We'll do anything for Latin America except read about it. You'd be surprised, Ronald Reagan told the American people after his first official trip to Central America. They're all individual countries. Can you imagine the level of ignorance of this previous actor, now very famous president, that didn't even realize that Central America was various countries? He thought it was one country. My goodness. So it should surprise nobody that a generation later, in 2006, Hal Turner, a prominent radio talk show host in New Jersey, whose show is broadcast around the country, would reveal nasty things about Latinos and revel in the idea of Latin America as the sinister, dark continent. His words, these filthy, disease-ridden, two-legged bags of human debris are too stupid to believe. He said on the air, just think, America, if we bring enough of them, they can do for America exactly what they did for that filth called Mexico. Turn our whole country into a crime-ridden, drug-infested slum. These people are subhuman. I would love it if folks that have weapons, that they would use them. I advocate machine gunning these invaders to death. And this is still going on podcasts on the internet. And you wonder why we're a divided country? This is all being allowed under the guise of freedom of speech. But you're not supposed to talk about killing people. But it's going on. But it's okay, I guess, because it hasn't stopped. Because they're talking about Latinos, scumbags, trash, subhuman people. It's not a big leap from those words uttered on American radio waves a dozen years ago to the rhetoric and the statement linked to the El Paso shooting suspect. If we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life could be more sustainable. Don't be surprised if it's words like these that prompted this young man to go into the Walmart in El Paso and kill so many Hispanics. And it's not a far cry from labels like subhuman to the tweets of a then president, from words like stupid, filthy, human debris, to words like rapist, criminals, invasion. These slurs against Latinos in one form or another have been in the American parlance for a very, very long time. The pity, of course, is that like the starving Irish fleeing the famine, or the Russians eluding the life or death dangers of the Pale, or the Germans shucking the very real hazards of religious oppression, Latin American immigrants risked that same flight to the north to escape concrete, life-threatening conditions, crime, drugs, poverty. Just like the Germans, the Irish, and the Russians. But they're not white. Of the 50 most violent cities in the world, 43 are in Latin America. Of the 25 countries with the highest murder rates, nearly half are south of the Rio Grande. To understand why this is so, we need to understand a half millennium of history, the cruel legacy of a brutal colonial structure and the rampant corruption of the white-brown caste system it has engendered. We need to understand the region's greatest affliction, its dire inequality. Latin America is the most unequal region on Earth, precisely because it has never ceased to be colonized by exploiters, conquerors, and for the past 2 centuries, multinational corporations, mostly American corporations, and then its own tiny elite that run the country. As economists have long argued, extractive societies such as Latin America's are built on social injustice. They're designed and maintained by a ruling class whose primary goal is to enrich themselves and perpetuate their power. They thrive when absolute privilege reigns over absolute poverty, but extractive nations are also programmed to fail on the long run. The damage caused by their endless raid on natural resources is all too enduring. It is violence, resentment, poverty, environmental damage, and crime. Fear is the engine that drives Latin Americans north. The irony is that so many are here because they were always here, as Mexican Americans like to say. They didn't cross the border crossed us. Or they're here because of the lure to emulate Hispanic Americans who are living better lives, and that's irresistible. Never before has a wave of immigrants joined such a large minority. Latinos in the United States now number 60 million, according to the Pew Research Center. That's a whopping 40% increase over 40 years. Almost 2/3 are native-born. Which is to say that whatever Jefferson and Adams and Nixon thought, they were obviously wrong. Latin America does matter to the United States. It always has. The long, complicated history that has convulsed nations and propelled Hispanics to our shores should be of the utmost importance to us as Americans. Latin America's history is not remotely like U.S. history. Its colonies were more exploited, its revolutions more extreme. It is a region unlike any other on the planet. We would do well to study it. It's about time we understood what Latin Americans bring with them when they come here. And it's about time we understood the deeply held racism that we use on them even to this day. I'm Juan Andres. You can always find us on the now over 60 sites on the internet where you can hear our programs. Just Google Radio Labio, Radio Labio, and you'll find us. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.